Keycloak is still my favorite identity provider in 2026, and in this video I'm going to show you the complete setup from getting started with Keycloak to integrating it into your .NET applications to implement authentication and authorization support. I'll be running a .NET 10 application that's using Docker Compose for local container orchestration, and the first thing we need to do is to get an instance of Keycloak up and running on our local machine. So to do that, I'm going to define Keycloak as another service inside of our system, and I'm already getting a completion from Visual Studio, which I'm going to ignore. However, this is the image I want to use. It's Quay.io Keycloak/Keycloak, and the latest version at the time of recording this video is 26.5.2. I will use the container name of Keycloak, and I also want to specify a startup command to start Keycloak in development mode. This is just going to use the local embedded database, and it's going to make running Keycloak locally easier. Alternatively, you could plug in your existing database. For example, it supports Postgres, SQL Server, and many other popular databases. So you're not only limited to the default Keycloak database. Then we have to pass in some environment variables to set up our admin account, and for development using admin and admin is perfectly sufficient. And one more variable I'm going to specify is the Keycloak health check. So I'll say KC health enabled, and let's go ahead and set this to true. Then I want to map some volumes. For this is actually just mapping a local folder to the internal folder in Keycloak, and the internal folder name is opt/keycloak/data. And then one more thing we want to expose is the ports where Keycloak will be available on our local system, and the default Keycloak port is 8080, but I'm additionally going to specify the port 9000, which is where the Keycloak health check endpoint is exposed. And then one more thing, which could be helpful if you've run into problems with Keycloak before when running it inside of a container, is specifying the root user. I've heard examples of Keycloak being unable to create the embedded database because of some access policies, and specifying the root user in development mode usually fixes this, but let's make sure to leave a comment that this is development only. So now when we run this using Docker Compose, it's going to spin up all of the services that we defined inside of our Compose file locally, and we'll be able to access them through the available ports. If I go to localhost 8080, we're going to see the Keycloak UI, where we can enter our admin username and password, and we're going to enter the Keycloak realm. Now I'm going to quickly create my realm, which I'm going to call auth demo. Let's go ahead and create it. One thing I want to configure on this realm, if I go to the realm settings and then login, is enable user registration, which is going to allow us to easily create new users, assuming we don't have one. And then let's create a public client that we're going to use from our user interface to authenticate with Keycloak. I'm going to call this our public client just for ease of use. I'll click next, leave the default settings here, and then we can go ahead and click next. For the valid redirect URIs, I want to use port localhost 5001, and I'm going to specify a wildcard using a star so that any URI with this address is a valid redirect URI. If you got a specific page that you only want to use for redirection, then you can go ahead and be granular and specify that page. Let's go ahead and save this, and now we can go into our .NET application and see how to integrate Keycloak as an identity provider step by step. I'm going to close down the Docker Compose YAML file, and I want to open up my program file. So right now, I don't have a lot of things going on here. I've got some OpenTelemetry set up, which is going to come in handy later when I show you a couple of interesting things with the Aspire dashboard. But for now, we have to figure out how to connect Keycloak with our application and integrate support for authenticating users, but also enforcing authorization policies. So for my Keycloak user interface, I'm going to use Swagger, and I need to install a NuGet package to be able to use it. So let's go ahead to browse, and I'm going to look for Swagger, and the base library is actually called Swashbuckle ASP.NET Core. It encapsulates both the Swagger UI and the Swagger OpenAPI generator, so that's what I'm going to install here. This will allow me to add two middleware to my setup, so I'll say app use Swagger. This is going to add the generator, and then app use Swagger UI to expose our user interface. Then we're going to need some sort of endpoint to be able to just validate that we've successfully authenticated. I like to call this endpoint users/me to represent the currently authenticated user. And one thing we can inject here is a claims principal that we're going to parse from our access token. And the simplest way to test this is to say return claims principal claims and then turn them into a dictionary, where I'm going to choose the claim type as the key and then the claim value as the dictionary value. So let's go ahead and wrap that. And finally, we want to add require authorization here to require an access token to be able to call this endpoint. Now, the next thing is going to be setting up our Swagger integration. I've got an extensions folder here with a service collection extensions class that is currently empty. And here I want to add an extension method. I'm going to make this static, returning an iService collection. And let's call this add Swagger gen with auth support. And as I said, this is an extension method on the iService collection interface, but we're also going to need access to iConfiguration to be able to fetch some values from our config. To make sure we satisfy the contract, let's just return these services right away. And then what I want to do here is call add Swagger gen, where I'm going to specify a delegate that is going to encapsulate everything we want to run here. And essentially what we're going to do here is set up a couple of Swagger specific things, but also add an integration with our OpenID Connect provider, which is Keycloak. This is going to allow us to use the authorization code flow with Keycloak as the identity provider to give us the access token that we're going to then pass to our backend, our API, to perform the authorization check. You'll see how this works when I show you some distributed traces. So what do we need to do to set this up? One thing I always like to do with Swagger is have my custom schema IDs, and then we need to add a security definition. I'm going to call this our Keycloak security definition, and this requires a new OpenAPI security scheme. Now, the important parts here are setting the type, which is going to be OAuth 2, and then we have to specify which flow we want to use, which is going to be a new OpenAPI auth flows, and this lets you set a couple of different flows supported by OAuth 2, and the one that we want is the authorization code flow, which is the most robust one and industry standard one. Or to be more precise, the industry standard currently is authorization code with PKCE, which is proof key for code exchange. And here we just pass in an object representing our authentication flow, where we can set a couple of things. And these things are mostly standard, and they represent the authorization URL, which is where you can kick off the authorization flow, which triggers the redirect to the identity provider. And the second one we're going to need is the token URL, which is the Swagger UI in this case, can then exchange the authorization code for the access token, which will be represented as a JSON web token. And this is where our configuration object comes in, where I'm going to pull the value from our settings, which is going to be Keycloak and then authorization URL. I'll use a null forgiving operator here, and then let me copy this and pass it in to the token URL. And I'll just make sure that we use the correct setting name. Then we're going to pass in any scopes that we might need to pass with our authorization request. I'm going to use two scopes, which are pretty standard. They're going to be the OpenID scope and the profile scope. So this is half of the story. We've added our security definition. We also need to add a security requirement, and this requires a delegate accepting our document and returning an OpenAPI security requirement. And here we can just new up a new OpenAPI security requirement, which internally accepts a dictionary of OpenAPI security scheme references. And an easy way to pass this is by passing in a new OpenAPI security reference, where the reference ID is the name of our OpenAPI security scheme that we defined above called Keycloak. So I'm going to just use that. And then we're going to also pass in our OpenAPI document. And for the second argument, which represents we can pass in an empty array using the collection expression syntax. So with this setup, we've integrated our Swagger UI with our identity provider, and we're going to be able to obtain an access token to pass along to our backend to authenticate on behalf of a user and access any resources that our server might expose. Now, what about these values here, the authorization URL and the token URL? Let me jump into Postman to show you how you can find these. So what I've got here is a GET request on the port 9000 to the health endpoint, which I'm going to send, and you can see we get back a 200 OK request letting us know that Keycloak is up and running. Then I'm going to replace this with a request like this, it's going to target localhost 8080, which is where the core of Keycloak is exposed. And we want to specify realms, then the name of our realm, which is auth demo, and then this is a well-known OpenID Connect route called well-known/OpenID configuration. So if you send a request like this, you will get back some useful info about your Keycloak instance. And the second and third responses here represent our authorization URL and the token URL. So I can go ahead and copy these and then use them inside of my app settings. So if I go back to Visual Studio and open up my app settings, here is the authorization URL that I need to pass in. And then the second argument is going to be the token URL, and the endpoint is just /token instead of /auth. And while we're here, we can also fill in the metadata address, which is the value that I just used in the Postman request, except I'm going to replace localhost with Keycloak, which is where my .NET app running in a container can find the Keycloak instance. I'll also specify the valid issuer using the value returned from the well-known endpoint. This is available on localhost, and the audience for our public client is going to be the account value. We'll also see this in the JSON Web Token that we get back from Keycloak. And one last thing that's left is to integrate support for validating JSON Web Tokens in our backend. So let me go ahead and look for a NuGet package called Microsoft ASP.NET Core Authentication JWT Bearer. I'll install the latest version, which is 10.0.2. Remember that we are running this on .NET 10. And then we have to add a couple of services to our service collection. I'll call the extension method that we just defined for configuring SwaggerGen with authentication support. Then I have to say builder services add authorization first. And after that, I'm going to say builder services add authentication, where I'm going to specify my authentication scheme using the JWT Bearer defaults constant, which just specifies the authentication scheme as bearer. Then I'm going to chain a call to add JWT Bearer, and here I'm going to pass in a delegate to configure how we are actually going to validate our JSON Web Token. So I'm going to set require HTTPS metadata to false because I'm only running Keycloak with HTTP. Then we have to specify our audience, which is going to come from our app settings, except the top level key is authentication. We're also going to do the same for the metadata address. I'll say builder configuration, and then let's specify the key as authentication metadata address. And lastly, I'm going to pass in some token validation parameters where I want to set the valid issuer, and this value we're also going to pick up from our app settings as authentication issuer. And one last thing you have to check before running this is that you've got the respective middleware added to your request pipeline. And the correct order of adding them is calling use authentication and then finally use authorization, and now we should be good to go. Let's go ahead and start the application, and this should open up the Swagger UI with the one endpoint that we have. And if we send a request, we should get back a 401 unauthorized response, which is what is happening, so that's good. I'll click the authorize button where you can see our authorization URL and the token URL with their respective values. We also have an option to specify the client ID, which is the public client that we created in Keycloak earlier, and I'll select both of the claims. Now, before clicking authorize, I'm going to open up the network tab in the developer tools, and now I'll click authorize and we'll get redirected to our Keycloak instance. So because we don't have a user, we also have an option to register as a new user. So I'll go ahead and fill in some data here. And now I should be able to click register and we'll get redirected back to the Swagger UI where you can see an additional request show up in the network tab, which is the request to get the access token from our Keycloak instance. In the payload, you'll find the authorization code that we got from the authorization flow, which redirected us to Keycloak, where we either input our credentials or we register as a new user. So now that we've got our access token, and now we should be able to send a request to our backend and get back a valid response, which contains all of the claims from the JSON Web Token that we got from Keycloak, and you can see the contents of this token here where you can copy this value and paste it into something like JWT.io, where you can verify that this is indeed a valid JSON Web Token, and also all the values here match the claims that we got back in the API response. So now we've got a fully integrated identity provider that implements the authorization code flow for getting the access tokens. Your next step would probably be to integrate this with some single page application to serve as your UI, but for backend development using Swagger UI for this is sufficient enough for our use cases. In a previous video, I also showed you how you could do this with Postman, so this kind of closes the loop of how to use Keycloak in 2026 with .NET 10 and all the latest changes that have happened in the space. If this was a little fast-paced for you, I've got a fully beginner-friendly Keycloak intro that you can check out here if you want to learn more about this. If you enjoyed this video, consider smashing the like button, click the subscribe button to see more videos like this one in the future. Thanks a lot for watching, and until next time, stay awesome.